This is St George's Church at Gooderstone in southwest Norfolk. Norfolk is known as one of the wealthiest counties of medieval England, where its churches were almost all completely rebuilt in the 15th century. But this is the poor part of Norfolk. Very thin soils led to unproductive agriculture, and so many of its churches survive from the 12th and 13th centuries with little intervention. You can see in this church we have the chancel immediately to my left, then the nave and the tower. It's a 3-cell church. Both ends, the tower and the chancel, are 13th century, and those tall windows you see are as a result of the most major rebuilding in the 15th century. But there's a lot more to this church than at first meets the eye. Here at the base of the tower we can see some of the construction of the church. The church is built of flint, the local building material. It's very rough and ready, but you can clearly see some horizontal lines in the stonework that represent the building seasons. These churches took many seasons to build, and they would build a few feet at a time, leave it, and then start again. And these horizontal lines that you see behind me are indicative, just like cutting through a tree trunk, of how many seasons growth or work, in this case, we can see. It wouldn't have been evident when the church was new because it would have been completely lime washed as a protection against the weather. One of the things that flints can't be used for is building a decent corner. And so the corners of the church were built using limestone, which was imported from other parts of the country. In this case, it came from the neighbouring county of Cambridgeshire, a distance of about 80 miles, and it would have travelled here by water. Just behind me you can see the corner has been infilled, and this shows where the staircase to the tower was inserted in the wall. So by going round the outside of a church you can see so many clues that help us to understand both its dating and function. Here we see the difference between the native flint on the left hand side and the dressed limestone forming the corner of the church on the right. This is the south wall of the chancel. The two windows to the left are early English, and you can see they don't have a hood mould at all. That means there's nothing over the top of them to protect the window from water running down over the glass. The bottom half of the left-hand window is blocked in. This would have been a low side window, and we'll see this again on the inside. To the right is a window of slightly later date. The greatest contrast in windows can be seen here on the north side. Behind me are the original 13th century lancet windows in the chancel, which was completely untouched when the nave was remodelled. And there on the north side of the nave, these magnificent perpendicular windows put in during the 15th century, when this part of Norfolk was particularly wealthy. You see they've got a horizontal line running through them, known as a transom, and this replicated that idea of cutting down on the verticals and putting horizontal emphasis into the glass. This large porch wasn't just to protect people going into church. It was in fact one of the communal meeting places for the village. This is why we have benches running down both sides of the porch. This is where the start of the marriage service took place. You may remember in the Wife of Bath story in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, she goes to the church door 5 times, obviously referring to her 5 marriages. The outstanding thing about this porch are these wonderful windows in the side. Decoration, yes, but also ventilation and a status symbol showing how important the donor of this porch thought they were. Having seen the porch, let's go into the church and find out what's in there. Today the nave is large and light, but that's because of the addition of those large windows in the north wall that we saw from the outside. Of course, at the same time that that wall was built, the roof was heightened. And so when you look up now, you see a much taller roof with a clerestory, a row of windows on the south side to bring light in over the roof of the south aisle. This font is typical for its period. It dates from the 15th century. In fact, we know the exact date of this font. It was given in 1446. It's octagonal. It has shields on each of its 8 faces, and these would originally have been painted with the shields of arms of the families who paid for it. As soon as the windows were renewed on the north side, the church was fitted out with these wonderful wooden benches. You see they each have a differently designed back. The back of the bench has been carved by individual carpenters. Each bench terminates with a fleur-de-lis carving, but below it would originally have been the image of a saint. You can see here just the lower part of the figure has been left. The upper half was taken off during the Reformation. In the front row of the church, this bench would be very difficult to sit in. And in fact, when we get closer, you realise that in fact there can't have been a bench here because there's a mortise in the stonework which would have taken a wooden screen that would have divided this arch off from the south aisle. So all's not what it seems in a medieval church. Things have been moved about over the centuries. The single most important furnishing in this church is the rood screen, dating again from the mid-15th century. It divides our part of the church from the chancel, where the Holy Mass took place. And like most churches in Norfolk, this screen was highly decorated. And amazingly, a lot of its decoration still survives. Along the base of the screen, we have the 12 apostles. You can see that above them are some scripts with writing on, and these are extracts from the Lord's Prayer. In the late Middle Ages, it was believed that each of the 12 apostles gave a line that was put together to form the Lord's Prayer. And so each one carries the text that he is supposed to have invented. Here we have the image of St. Peter. We know it's St. Peter because he's holding 2 large keys. And above him is the inscription, in fact it's the start of the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. More interestingly with this screen, each of the images of the saints is depicted as being painted on a cloth which is held up, as you see here, by an angel. Each one is slightly different. This, of course, is the figure of St. Andrew with the X-shaped cross on which he was crucified. Each of the saints is easily identified. Here is St. John the Evangelist, whose emblem is a chalice with a devil in it. As well as the images of the saints, we also have an inscription which runs along the top of this screen. And this refers to the donors, the families who paid for this screen to be erected in the 15th century. I'm now in the south aisle, the extension put on in the 14th century, and I wanted to show you the top of the altar. It's a medieval top known as a mensa, solid stone slab, and it must have been thrown out at the Reformation and then brought back into use in the church, probably by the Victorians or possibly in the early 20th century. I've just pulled back part of the cloth and you can see that it's a solid stone piece which has an incised cross. This is one of 5 crosses on this slab which represented the 5 wounds of Christ. Although all altars have these incised crosses on, if it's in a stone slab that shows signs of antiquity, it must be from the medieval church. And it's rather nice that it was brought back into use. The chancel of the church is entirely 13th century and wasn't altered in any way when the rest of the church was remodelled. See here in the southeast corner of the sanctuary is the double piscina. This is the drain where the priest would wash his fingers and the chalice before Mass. Most piscinae from the Middle Ages are a single drain, but from the 1290s, for about a generation, it was fashionable to be putting two drains in, one specifically for the fingers and the other for the chalice. Cutting through it, you can see a horizontal moulding. This is absolutely typical of the 13th century. They liked to divide their tall buildings into layers, and so this forms a dado, if you like, from which all the architectural features, the windows, would spring. On the opposite side of the altar to the piscina, we find this double cupboard. It's an aumbry, the cupboard that contained the church valuables, the silver, for instance, but also the chrism oil, the oil that was purchased from the cathedral every Easter and which had to last all year. It was used for various sacraments, from baptism to extreme unction, the last rites. So it was one of the most important things that each parish church possessed. We saw this little door on the outside of the chancel. It's what's known as a low side window. There is still much debate as to what its function was, possibly for ringing a bell, but more likely as ventilation. When the south aisle was built, a piscina was added, and this one, as you see, only has a single drain, but it also has these shelves, credence shelves, and this is where the jugs of water to be used in the ablutions would have been stored. It's a very fine example of 14th century design. The poll box was put into this church over 500 years ago. You can see that it's carved from a single piece of oak that has then been covered with metalwork to protect it from theft. So theft in churches is certainly not a modern day problem. This 14th century image of God the Father from the east window of the south aisle was put in by the lady who financed its construction, the Countess of Pembroke. Like most churches, this shows the wealth of the owners who created the buildings we enjoy today.